My name is Walter Bennett. I'm 87 years old. At this age, people expect stories about the old days. They expect laughter about things that happened long ago, or neat little reflections that make life sound like it all came together in the end. But the truth is quieter than that. When you live long enough, you begin to notice that some things in your life never really settle. They just sit there, somewhere in the background, waiting. I've carried one of those things for more than 50 years. I didn't think of it as something heavy at first, not really. It felt small at the time. Just one of those ordinary moments that passed by without much ceremony. But time has a way of changing the size of things. What once felt small can slowly grow until it fills an entire room in your memory. And when the house gets quiet, you start hearing it again. The moment I'm thinking about happened when I was 34. That was 1973. I worked as a delivery driver back then, not the kind you see now with fancy trucks and uniforms, just a faded brown van with the company name peeling off the side. I delivered office supplies around 3 counties, paper boxes, staplers, ink ribbons for typewriters, the sort of things that felt important back when every office had the same humming machines and the same smell of carbon paper. Most days started early. I'd leave before the sun finished rising, coffee in a metal travel mug, radio barely loud enough to hear over the engine. Those were long roads back then. Long stretches between towns where the fields just rolled out endlessly on both sides. I didn't mind it. There's something peaceful about driving when you're young and you think the road ahead just keeps going forever. Back then I was married. Her name was Margaret. I used to call her Maggie when we were younger. She never said whether she liked that or not, but she never stopped me either. She worked nights at the hospital. Not a nurse, just the front desk clerk who checked people in and answered the phones when the halls got quiet. Our schedules rarely lined up. Most mornings when I left for work, she was just getting home. I'd find her in the kitchen sometimes, shoes kicked off under the table, hair tied loosely at the back of her neck. She always looked tired in that gentle way people do when they've been awake too long. But she still smiled when I walked in. I remember that clearly. The smile came before the words. And most mornings we only had a few minutes together. Just enough time to stand in the same room, say a few things about the day, maybe share a cup of coffee if she hadn't already finished hers. Back then, it all felt temporary, like we were just passing through a busy season of life. We talked about the future sometimes, about getting a slightly bigger place, about maybe having children once things settled down. I remember believing very strongly that there would always be time for those things later. Time had that feeling when you're young, wide, unhurried, like something you could reach into whenever you needed it. The day I'm thinking about started quietly. I came home around noon between deliveries. That happened sometimes if my route doubled back through town. The house was still. Sunlight came through the kitchen window in that pale afternoon way. Not bright, just soft enough to make dust float slowly in the air. Margaret was sitting at the table. She hadn't gone to bed yet, even though her shift had ended hours earlier. I remember noticing that first. She had both hands wrapped around a mug that had long since stopped steaming. There was something about the way she was sitting, very still, that made me pause in the doorway. I asked if she was all right. She said she was. but her voice had that careful sound people use when they're thinking about something they're not sure how to say. I hung my keys on the hook near the door, the same hook they'd hung on every day since we moved into that little house. It's strange what the mind keeps. I can't remember what shirt I wore that day, but I remember the way those keys sounded against the wall. Margaret looked at me for a long moment, not the quick glance couples give each other when they pass in the hallway. This was longer, quiet, like she was measuring something. Then she said there was something she wanted to talk about. Nothing dramatic, just those words. I sat down across from her. The kitchen clock was ticking louder than usual, or maybe I was just noticing it more. She started speaking slowly, about the night shifts, about the way the hospital halls felt when everyone else had gone home, about the hours she spent sitting behind the desk while the building slept. At first, I thought she was just tired. People talk when they're tired. They wander through thoughts without really meaning anything by them. But then she said something that I didn't understand at the time. She said sometimes she felt like our life was happening in two separate rooms, her room and mine. And most days we only visited each other for a few minutes in the hallway. I remember laughing a little, not because it was funny, just because I didn't quite know what she meant. I said things would settle down eventually, that work wouldn't always be this busy, that we'd have more time later. I remember saying later very clearly. It felt like a reasonable answer. At least it did to the man I was then. Margaret nodded slowly when I said it, but she didn't smile that time. She looked down at the mug in her hands instead. After a moment, she said she had been thinking about taking a different job, day shifts at a small clinic outside town. It would mean different hours, different routines, maybe a different direction for things. I told her that sounded complicated. My route was built around my current schedule. Changing things would make life messy for a while. I said maybe we should think about it longer. Maybe we should wait. Again, I didn't notice the silence that followed right away, but it was there, sitting between us at the table. And if I'm honest, that silence is the part that stayed with me the longest. Because after a while, Margaret nodded again, very gently, and she said something simple. She said, "All right." Then she stood up, rinsed the mug in the sink, and told me she was going to get some sleep. Just like that, the conversation ended, and I went back out to finish my deliveries. I drove the rest of my route that afternoon like nothing important had happened. Boxes in, signatures out, miles passing under the tires. It felt like an ordinary day, but when I think about it now, after all these years, I can see that something quiet had shifted in that kitchen, something I didn't understand until much later when the house was empty, and the hallway between our two rooms had grown so wide that neither of us knew how to cross it anymore. And the strange part is, the moment that finally made me understand it all didn't happen until decades later, long after Margaret had stopped sitting at that kitchen table, long after the sound of those keys on the wall had become just another memory. That realization came on a quiet evening when I was already an old man, standing alone in that same kitchen, holding a mug that had long since gone cold, and remembering a conversation that lasted less than 10 minutes. That's when I finally saw something I hadn't seen before. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. But that part of the story took 50 years to arrive, and it begins with something small, something Margaret said that afternoon that I didn't really hear.
After that afternoon, I went back to my deliveries. The van was warm from the sun, the engine humming, tires rolling over familiar roads. I remember thinking about nothing in particular, just the rhythm of the route, the weight of boxes in my hands. I didn't notice that something had shifted back at home. I didn't realize that a single later could stretch across a lifetime. When I think about it now, I see how small moments can quietly mark the shape of everything else. That day, that conversation, it was less about words and more about absence. She had tried to reach across a narrow space between us that I didn't even know existed. And I stayed where I was. I didn't lean in. I didn't pause. I just kept moving forward with the rest of my day. Weeks turned into months. I kept the same schedule. She kept hers. The house stayed the same, yet something imperceptible began to grow. Not loud, not dramatic, just a subtle distance that neither of us named. There were dinners where one of us would glance at the other and decide it wasn't worth bringing up. Nights where we slept on opposite sides of the bed, our backs facing each other, quiet, pretending nothing had changed. I remember a winter evening, maybe 6 months after that afternoon, when I came home early. The sky had turned a soft gray and snow had begun to cover the streets. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a mug that had gone cold. I wanted to ask her something, anything, but I didn't. The words caught in my throat. I watched her from the doorway and slowly realized that we had stopped sharing those little things that made life feel like it belonged to both of us. And yet, life went on. Work kept me busy. Bills, deliveries, small errands. We kept living in parallel tracks, in the same house, in the same rooms, yet somehow apart. I didn't see it at the time, or maybe I didn't want to see it. It was easier to think later would fix things than to confront that quiet gap forming between us. I carried that afternoon with me. Not consciously at first. It lived in the back of my mind like a shadow I ignored. Little pieces would pop up, a glance she gave me that lingered too long, a half-finished cup of coffee, the creak of the porch boards when she stepped outside before I even noticed. All these tiny fragments whispered that something was different, that time had already begun to pull us apart. It took decades to understand it fully, not all at once, not in a sudden revelation. It came slowly, in quiet evenings like this, when the house is empty, the lamps are warm, and the past drifts forward to sit beside me. I can see her then, not as she was in the photographs, but as she was in those moments we never acknowledged. The tired line of her jaw, the way her eyes would flicker toward me, hoping I'd notice something I never did.
I understand now that the words later and we'll see are not innocent. They are small decisions that shape everything that comes after. I can see it in the gaps between us, in the spaces where a conversation should have been, where a touch, a glance, a gesture could have stayed us together. And I see it in myself, the man who kept moving, kept working, kept thinking time would be patient with us. By the time I realized it, she was long gone. The house was empty, the keys hung on the same hook, but the warmth of her presence was only a memory. And the quiet truth hit me. That day, that short conversation was not just ordinary, it was pivotal. The moment I could have leaned in, could have paused, could have truly seen her, I didn't, and everything afterward was shaped by that choice. I've carried it for more than 50 years, and here, at 87, I finally understand what she was trying to say without saying anything at all. The realization isn't loud, it isn't dramatic, it is quiet, slow, and unavoidable.
Sitting here in the evening light, I can feel the weight of it, the smallness of the moment that became the axis of my life. Sometimes I think about how different things might have been. Sometimes I think about how she must have felt, waiting for me to notice. But mostly, I just sit here with the memory, the photograph, the cold mug, the empty chair. I let it be what it is. And maybe that's the only way to live with a life like this. Quietly, observing, remembering, finally seeing. Not changing anything, because it is too late, just feeling it fully. If you're still here with me, I'll leave you with that. Sit with it if you can. Feel the smallness, the quiet, the weight of what's unspoken. It's the part of life that leaves the deepest mark, even when no one else notices.